70 days. That is how long the King of Pop lay waiting in the dark, while the world outside lit candles, sang his songs, and wept in the streets. Michael Jackson's body was not resting in peace. Instead, he was trapped in a cold, suspended reality, caught in a crossfire of family feuds, legal battles, and a terrifying paranoia that followed him from life into death. We are told that death is the great equalizer, the final moment of rest for every weary soul. But for Michael Jackson, death was merely the beginning of a new kind of chaos. 3 times his plans were changed. 3 times the location of his eternal soul was shifted. Why was it so impossible to find a single patch of earth for the most famous man on the planet? The official story speaks of logistics and permits. But the real story, the one whispered behind the marble walls of Forest Lawn, is one of fear. A fear so deep that it drove a family to hide their son behind concrete and cameras, terrified that the world would try to take a piece of him, literally. This is the untold story of the 3 moves, the 70 days of silence, and the heartbreaking reason why Michael Jackson had to be hidden away to finally be free. It began almost the instant the music stopped. In the chaotic hours following the announcement at the UCLA Medical Center, while the fans began to gather like a rising tide, a rift was tearing the Jackson family apart from the inside. The question wasn't just how to mourn him, but where to put him. And that question reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Jermaine Jackson, Michael's older brother, was adamant. In his eyes, there was only one place that made sense: Neverland. The sprawling ranch in Santa Barbara County that Michael had built from his imagination. Jermaine saw a vision of the future that mirrored the legacy of Elvis Presley. He wanted Neverland to become a sanctuary, a Graceland for the King of Pop, where millions could come, walk the grounds, and pay tribute. He argued passionately that Michael's spirit was woven into the oak trees and the statues of that valley. He even went so far as to initiate the paperwork, pushing for a change in California state law to allow a burial on private residential property. For a moment, it seemed like the logical conclusion to a fairy tale life. But across the table, sitting in a silence that carried more weight than any shout, was Katherine Jackson, the matriarch, the woman who knew Michael not as an icon, but as a son. She shook her head. Her refusal was quiet, but it was absolute. She knew a truth that the fans, and even some family members, didn't want to admit. Michael didn't love Neverland anymore. After the 2005 trial, after the police raids that tore through his personal sanctuary, Michael had told her he felt violated. The magic had been stripped from the walls. He had left that place and vowed never to live there again. Katherine felt that dragging his body back to the site of his greatest trauma would be a final act of cruelty. She argued that he deserved dignity, not to be turned into a tourist attraction in the place that had broken his heart. The tension in the family compound was suffocating. It was a battle between preserving a legacy and respecting a soul. And while they argued, the clock was ticking. The reality of the situation soon crushed Jermaine's dream. The local government of Santa Barbara threw up immediate roadblocks. The residents of the Quiet Valley were horrified at the idea of a perpetual pilgrimage site. They envisioned traffic jams, noise, and an endless circus of mourners disrupting their lives. The permits were denied. The laws would not be changed in time. The dream of a Neverland burial collapsed under the weight of bureaucracy and bad blood. But this failure left a vacuum. If not Neverland, then where? The indecision stretched from days into weeks. And this is where the story turns into something darker, something more haunting. Michael's body was moved to the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, and then to Glendale, but not to a grave. He was placed in a temporary holding crypt, a cold storage facility designed to keep the dead preserved while the living make up their minds. Imagine the scene. The most photographed, most talked about human being in history, lying alone in a sterile room, day after day, week after week. Outside, the summer heat of Los Angeles beat down on the pavement where fans left teddy bears and letters. Inside, The air was freezing. For over 2 months, Michael Jackson remained unburied. This period, known as the limbo, is perhaps the most tragic chapter of the entire saga. It wasn't just indecision, it was a security nightmare. As the delay dragged on, the rumors began to swirl in the dark corners of the internet and the tabloids. And these weren't just harmless gossip, they were threats. Intelligence reached the family's security team that rattled them to their core. There were whispers of grave robbers. There were obsessive fans and criminals who saw Michael's remains not as a person, but as the ultimate artifact. The fear was that if he were buried in a conventional grave, or even a standard crypt, someone would try to dig him up. It sounds like the plot of a gothic horror movie, but for the Jacksons, it was a very real possibility. They had lived their lives under the microscope. They knew that obsession knows no boundaries. This paranoia led to the second phase of the movement. Sources from within Forest Lawn have whispered for years that during this holding period, Michael's casket was moved more than once within the facility. A shell game played with a golden casket. Workers at the cemetery were forced to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Cell phones were confiscated at the start of shifts. The name Michael Jackson was forbidden over the radio. He was referred to only by a code, often just MJ or a specific number. The atmosphere was less like a cemetery and more like a military black site. One night, under the cover of darkness, security teams were seen moving a payload from the main storage area to a more secure, basement-level vault. Why? Because a paparazzi drone had been spotted too close to the building, or perhaps because a fan had been caught trying to scale the perimeter fence. The family could not take a single risk. They were terrified that a photograph of his lifeless face would appear on the cover of a tabloid the next morning. The sanctity of his death was under siege, just as his privacy had been in life. This constant state of high alert broke Catherine's heart. She visited the temporary site, often late at night to avoid the cameras, and she saw the toll it was taking. She realized that they couldn't just bury him. They had to hide him. They had to build a fortress. The search for the final resting place shifted from finding a beautiful spot to finding an impenetrable one. They looked at the great mausoleum in Forest Lawn, Glendale. It is a massive cathedral-like structure, filled with replicas of Michelangelo's statues and stained glass. It is grand, yes, but more importantly, it is secure. It is a building within a gated park, protected by layers of stone and security guards. But even that wasn't enough. The decision was made to place Michael in the Holly Terrace, a private wing of the Great Mausoleum that is inaccessible to the general public. But they didn't just place him in a crypt. According to those close to the arrangements, the family took unprecedented measures. The plan involved encasing the casket in concrete, not just a stone slab, but a heavy industrial pour that would seal the coffin into the structure of the building itself. There were reports of sensor systems, cameras pointed directly at the entry, and 24-hour monitoring. This was the third move, the final commitment. It was an admission that Michael Jackson could never belong to the world again. To keep him, they had to lock him away. By late August, the heat was breaking, and the decision was final. The funeral was set for September 3rd. Think about that date, June 25th to September 3rd. An eternity in the world of grief. When the day finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured grass of Forest Lawn. The guest list was small. The cameras that had followed him since he was a child were kept at a distance. This was not a show. This was a closure. A caravan of luxury cars wound its way through the gates, carrying a family that looked exhausted, drained by months of fighting and sorrow. The ceremony itself was hauntingly beautiful and incredibly quiet. As the golden casket, topped with a mound of red roses and white lilies, was carried into the great mausoleum, the silence was heavy. There was no screaming crowd, no flashing bulbs, just the sound of footsteps on marble and the distant hum of the highway. Gladys Knight sang quietly. The family said their prayers, but the most poignant moment came when they had to walk away, leaving him there behind those massive doors, knowing that they were leaving him in a vault of solitude. Germaine, who had fought so hard for Neverland, looked defeated but resigned. Catherine looked like a woman who had finally exhaled after holding her breath for 70 days. She turned to the cemetery staff before she left and reportedly gave a single instruction: keep him safe. It was a simple request, but it carried the weight of the world. In the years that followed, the Great Mausoleum became a place of mystery. Fans travel from all over the globe to stand outside the building. They cannot go in. They cannot see the tomb. They can only stand at the glass doors or leave flowers at the steps. Some say this is cruel, that the fans made him who he was and deserve to pay their respects. But others, those who understand the true tragedy of his life, see it differently. They see the concrete and the locked doors not as a barrier to them, but as a shield for him. Rumors still persist, of course. That is the nature of Michael Jackson's story. Some conspiracy theorists claim he was moved again, secretly, to a completely different location, unbeknownst to the public. They analyze satellite images and debate the landscaping changes at Forest Lawn. They claim the concrete story is a decoy, but these are just echoes of the same obsession that necessitated the security in the first place. The truth is likely far more still and far more sad. He's there in the Holly Terrace beneath tons of stone and surveillance, finally granted the one thing he chased his entire adult life: privacy. The story of the three moves, from the dream of Neverland to the cold limbo of the temporary vault to the concrete fortress of the Great Mausoleum, is not just a story about logistics. It is a symbol of the tragedy of fame. It reveals a heartbreaking reality: that the world's love for Michael Jackson was so intense, so consuming, that it became dangerous. His family had to bury him like a pharaoh, not to honor his godhood, but to protect his humanity. They realized that the only way to stop the world from taking pieces of him was to remove him from the world entirely. As we look back on those 70 days of uncertainty, we see the final struggle of a family trying to reclaim their son from the icon the world owned. And in the end, the silence of Forest Lawn is the only victory they could achieve. The lights are off. The music has faded. And behind those heavy walls, safe from the cameras, safe from the fans, safe from the expectations, Michael Jackson finally sleeps. He is alone, but perhaps, for the first time, he is truly at peace.